can hear me?
Can you see the announcement? Recording is
Yes.
right. Okay, so this is already recording. And I think
Okay.
Audience now can see us. We have 13, 14, so the number is increasing now, 15, 16. Yes.
Okay, so I think we can start. So
I think we need to wait a couple more minutes.
Yeah, we have
still
2 or
early.
3 more minutes.
okay.
We're on Japanese time, remember, we have to be precise.
Yes, it's not yet 10. I thought it was
Yeah, but
already.
since when is Italian time starting early?
Italian has another.
Phil, depends which part of Italy you are.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'm not going to get into the German-Italian thing. Okay, no.
Milano is part nearly.
Yeah.
Like the Italy.
So we have now 27. So I think you can also you can see the list of attendants on the right-hand side of the screen. Can you see it? It shows panelists and also it shows attendance.
Yes.
So it's increasing now.
Yes.
Right.
This one check. Luca says hi. Hello, everybody. Can you see it?
Okay. Yes. Ciao, Luca.
Yeah, this is chat from Luca. Q&A. This is after Q&A.
Yes. I'm
greetings. So it's 5:10. Then we can start now.
Okay. Japanese time, so we must really be very precise. And first of all, good morning to everybody. In Italy now is 10 o'clock, and good evening to the Japanese participants. We are here to present this webinar that is called Framing Islands and the Ocean, Osaka-Milan Perspective. The idea is to bridge the 2 IGU events, the Conference of Osaka on Islands in Relation, Conflicts, Sustainability and Place, and the IGU conference that will be held then in Milan on the ocean and sea in geographical thought. The idea is that the 2 events are linked together and to bridge them with this webinar that will be held in different places, so in Osaka and Milan now, and try to provide some more significant and comprehensive presentation and idea of what can be in common between the 2 events. We have here, first of all, the main organizer of the Osaka conference, Takashi Yamazaki, who is professor at Osaka Metropolitan University and is working now on the militarization of Okinawa and other places, and on, I will say, critical geopolitics in Japan, and also on foreign policies. He has been member of the IGU Commission on Political Geography, and he is the main actor, I will say, of the Osaka conference, who has been a very successful conference. And I must say that we, as Milan organizer, are very dependent on him. We learn a lot from his organization. We will have then two main speakers and presenter. The first will be Godfrey Baldacchino, I mean, well known in island studies, professor of sociology at the University of Malta, and ambassador of large for islands and small state. He has been very active in many years on activity related to islands, and he has been the president of the International Small Island Studies Association. He will present he was in Osaka, obviously, and he will present his point of view only about the two conferences. And then Phil Steinberg, who is EU Arctic Chair in Political Geography at Durham University, also very well known for his publication. He's also working on the Durham Arctic Research Center. He's the director, and published a lot of fundamental works on ocean and island studies. He will be also present in Milano as one of the keynote speakers. The two presentations will be connected by Elena dell'Agnese as discussant. Elena dell'Agnese is a professor of geography at the University of Milano-Biccoca, where she teaches environmental justice and geopolitics of the sea. And she has been also working on tourism, cultural geography, political geography in different places. So we will organize the session with some brief presentation, and then Elena, who will be the discussant and present other questions. Oh, I just forgot to present myself. I am Marcella Schmidt Friedberg. I've been member of the Commission of Gender Geography, of the IGU Commission of Gender and Geography, and now I am chair of the History of Geography Commission of the IGU, and also in occasion of the this connection of events, I'm now organizing the Milan Conference of Ocean and Sea in Geographical Thought that will be just briefly presented at the end of this meeting. So I will give you now the word directly to Godfrey to see.
Thank you, Marcella. Thank you for that introduction. And of course, I join you in extending a warm good morning or a warm good afternoon or anything in between to our colleagues, not just in Italy, of course, and in Japan, but in other parts of the world. I'm currently in Croatia. I've been lecturing at the University of Split, which is a port city, and not exactly outside my window, but very close to my hotel. I have a view of the port with the islands just offshore. So it's very difficult to forget islands while you are in a place like this. I've taken the liberty to post on the webinar chat a tentative definition of a human being. A human is a series of interrelated organs enveloped in skin. I'm sure you've never come across such a definition, but you see, it's very similar to the definition of an island, because very often the current definitions of islands are about what surrounds them. We very often define an island by its frame. In fact, the name of the seminar is Framing Islands and the Ocean. We say that islands are pieces of land, usually smaller than a continent, usually above above the sea at high tide that are surrounded by water, right? So that is the common definition. It's a definition we continue to use, even as we become a bit more sophisticated in our understanding of islands, and yet the definition sticks. Perhaps it is a telling reminder of how important the ocean is in the study of islands, just as much as perhaps the study of skin is also important in trying to understand a human being. In fact, the skin is the body's largest organ. So I think it's a good way to start. We have a definition of islands that reminds us continuously of the way in which islands are supposed to be related by the ocean. And I'm sorry, it's not just about framing here. Island life and ocean life is much more than a relationship of framing. It's an intimate, it's an iterative, it's a dynamic relationship. In fact, I would argue that we still don't know, or rather we know very little of the relationship between islands and the ocean. This is one of the areas where I hope both ocean studies, island studies, and anything in between will be heading in the next few years. Initiatives like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea have not exactly helped this understanding, because of course, even though that breakthrough at a global level has been heralded as something very important for islands, at the same time, it has led to a territorialization of the ocean. We have now extended the parameters, the legal coda, the understandings, the governance practices of lands, and extended them out into the sea. So in a way, we have prevented ourselves, thanks to this recent initiative, from a better understanding of the ocean as ocean. So in order to provide this, well, provocative introduction this morning at this webinar, and trying to bridge between the Osaka and the Milan conferences, I'm just going to take you a little bit on a journey. It's a very selective journey, so I'm not going to be thorough, of course, I don't have the time, but I hope you will get the point I'm trying to make. I'll be trying to make the point that islands have been progressively marginalized in the way in which we understand the world. And oceans have suffered the same fate. So islands and oceans are companions in distress here. I'm going to take you back. Let me see if I can share my screen. Just as a reminder that in various mythological stories of the origin of the world and of the theology that surrounds the world, we have stories where the ocean, where the sea is front and center. This is a very famous painting. Of course, my colleagues in Italy will be very pleased I'm showing this painting. It's a Botticelli from the late 15th century. It's supposed to show the birth of Venus. It's hosted by the Uffizi Gallery, I believe, in Florence. And of course, Aphrodite, as it's known in Greek mythology, or Venus in Roman mythology, is born from the sea. The shell on which she stands as she comes out of the ocean is a reminder that the goddess of love and beauty is a creation of the ocean, and she is a gift of the ocean to mankind, to civilization. And of course, there's a connection with islands here, because the alleged birthplace on the real world of Aphrodite is a rock off the shore of Paphos in Cyprus. It's a place called Petru to Romiou. Some of you may have visited this place. It's really beautiful. Right along the sea edge, and once again reminding us of the imbrication between land and sea. So Aphrodite was born from the ocean. We need to remind ourselves as well, Poseidon, the brother of Zeus, was the god of the sea, very important, one of three brothers who ended up dividing the universe amongst themselves. Poseidon took over the sea, Zeus took over the sky, and Hades took over the underworld. So those were the three branches of creation that these brothers were supposed to lord over. Unfortunately, well, for the brothers, for Hades and Poseidon, Zeus kind of took over, if not realistically, then metaphorically, and he became de facto the god of the gods, whereby Poseidon and Hades then became relegated to, to their different departments. it's also interesting that as we move forward, we find that the world's monotheistic religions, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they are all very terrestrial religions. Their center of gravity is land. Their sacred spaces are on land within Rome, Jerusalem, Judea, Mecca, Medina, right? So the sea, the water, in fact, in these religions has a purifying meaning. It's there to cleanse us. It's there to remove our sins, to anoint us, to initiate us into sacred statuses. So the sea has no place in monotheistic religions, which is unfortunate, I think, because, as I said, we need to replace, pun intended, we need to replace the sea as a very central activity in our relationships, both amongst ourselves, but also with the sea itself. The sea, we know more about Mars, the surface of the planet Mars, than we know about the bottom of the sea. I mean, this sounds very strange, but I think it's something we need to remind ourselves about, in spite of all the advantages and the advances of science. So the sea is space that needs to be recognized on its own merits. It is populated by many, many species, many of which, of course, are highly stressed by climate change and acidification and warming temperatures. Coral reefs, in particular, are suffering a beating and are being stressed because of rising acidification and temperatures. And therefore, let me conclude by suggesting perhaps that we need to become once again more amphibian in our approaches, combining islands and oceans in our perspective. This is a theme that is very well handled by Tasmanian fiction writer Richard Flanagan. His books like Death of a River Guide and Gould's Book of Fish are, I think, essential reading for people interested in island studies and ocean studies. Once again, let us remind ourselves of the need to be fair to nature, be fair to the ocean, and give it the importance and significance that I believe it deserves, not just in the study of islands, but in the study of the human condition generally and of nature in an even broader space. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Elena?
Yes. Well, it's difficult to make a question because what Godfrey has been saying is so important and cannot be discussed. Yes, we must try to put more attention towards the connection between islands and the sea. And yes, the sea has been almost forgotten in the history of political geography. We never think about the sea, actually. We have never been thinking about it. We have been thinking about conquering some choke point in order to have more power, but not about the sea. So this growing attention toward the sea and the ocean actually as a focus in political geography, as in cultural geography, is something that is quite recent, at most no more than 2 decades, and very, very important. And in this sense, I would like to underline the role of Phil Steinberg in doing that. And maybe I would like to discuss the two presentations together in the next stop. So I think that maybe we can listen to Phil, and then I will try to say something more relevant about, hopefully more relevant or not irrelevant.
In the original program, we had, first of all, the presentation of Takashi, but as I rightly understand, Godfrey had then to leave. I think we can have at the end Takashi with his presentation, so what has been happening before, and then the last part on Milan. So it's okay, Godfrey?
Yes, of course.
because you said you have to go to some museum. You have an important appointment. It's okay, Takashi. Takashi? Oh,
Should I
I
start
didn't-
now or should I wait?
I didn't get your answer. Okay. I lost Takashi.
Takashi, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear. Should I start?
Do you saw my message? Yes.
Okay. So let me share the screen now. All right,
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
no. Sorry, I was proposing, Takashi. Sorry, Takashi.
Okay.
Yes. No, I was proposing that we have first the discussion because
Okay. That's
Godfrey,
fine.
yes, and so now Phil, and then you come with your presentation if it's okay for you. Do you hear me?
I'm fine
Okay.
with, yeah, I think Takashi just muted himself. So
Okay.
that's what- so
Because I wrote to him.
Okay, can people hear me? Am I all
Yes.
right? Okay. So actually this ordering I think works fine because so much of what I'm saying will fit in so well with what Godfrey has talked about, which is in a sense it's always a little bit surprising to me and always not surprising at all when I see Godfrey and myself on the same page. And actually in a funny way, that's a sort of metaphor maybe for where we come from. Godfrey is, I guess, the island studies person here, and I'm the ocean studies person. And on one sense, we're speaking very different languages coming out of different literatures, different perspectives. And yet in the end, we end up kind of saying the same thing. And as I say, that actually, I think, speaks to the interrelations of island and ocean studies that we're trying to achieve today. So that works nicely. And this is a very important question. What's being posed here is how can ocean studies and island studies speak to each other? When I was given this charge to think about this, I actually went back to the Osaka conference, which we'll hear more about shortly from Takashi, where there was a roundtable of the keynoters at the end of the session, where we were posed a few questions, but one of them was fairly similar to the question we're being asked here. The question that was posed was, given that oceans and islands are inseparable in the real world, as we've just heard about, given that, how can we use insights from island studies to help our understanding of the oceans and vice versa? And again, that's close enough to what we're being asked to engage here that I thought I might as well begin preparing for this talk by going back and listening to the video from there, which, by the way, is available to everyone. I assume Takashi will mention that as well. So running through the keynoters and what we all said, Godfrey, not too surprisingly for anyone who just heard him here, stressed some of the material interactions and dependencies between islanders and the sea. As Godfrey noted, for islanders, quoting Derek Walcott, the sea is history, it shapes islanders' lives, and indeed islandness can be measured in how strong the sea exists in the memory of the islanders. And again, that lines up very well with some of what he just presented a few minutes ago. Akihiro Iwashita kind of picked up on this issue of material relations and dependencies and stressed that actually there are many different kinds of islands that have different relations with the seas or the islands around them or the mainlands. So that we need to look at these relations. I guess one way you might say, going back to Godfrey's point, is not all islands have the same skin. Sure, it's important to look at the skin, but some humans have better skin than other humans, I guess, or at least different skin. So that means looking at, for Akihiro, really the specificity of different spatial relations. And then that point, relationality, was very much taken up by Alison Mounts, who noted that really thinking with islands or thinking with oceans always involves thinking in relations. Islands are never just land in opposition to the sea, or just isolated in opposition to connection. And actually, one could also say that oceans are never just empty or just full with meaning, with memory, with biota, etc. In other words, thinking with islands or oceans requires one to think outside a binary framework. And as Alison went on to note, the goal there is not really to flip what's in the center so that you're now centering with island peoples, because that would kind of go against the relationality that she's trying to promote, but rather to learn to think from an islander's perspective so that you're looking at the continual crossings of islands and seas and look at how islanders understand these crossings. And that, she proposes, could sort of lead to what she calls a radical centering, where you're putting something in the center, but also throwing it off center at the same time. Hiroka Matsuda, in a way, kind of picked up on that, not directly, but indirectly, by focusing on extraterritoriality. As she noted, extraterritoriality is a major theme in oceans and in islands. And so actually thinking with extraterritoriality also upends binaries of land and sea that are behind our simplistic ideas of islands and oceans. And then it came to me. And I probably should have planned more for that session than I did. And so thinking kind of on the cuff and listening to the others, what really occurred to me as an answer to Takashi's question, and I want to expand on that a bit here, is that maybe we could all benefit from rereading Epali Haofa. Of course, Haofa is this, touchstone in island studies, and he's cited all the time. But as often happens when one becomes a touchstone, one gets cited for that one phrase that everyone remembers, and one, forgets like everything that's behind it. So of course, it's easy to cite Haofa as stressing that small islands should be seen as big. But beneath that seemingly simplistic call for island pride, Haofa is actually arguing for something more complex. For starters, he's not just calling for us to rethink islands, but also to rethink oceans. And in doing so, he's suggesting that by listening to islanders, to their livelihoods, to their epistemologies, we can learn to think beyond the divisions that structure modern Western continentalist perspectives on space and politics, and of course, land and sea as well. And those kinds of ways of thinking that make continentalist thought possible. So the classic summary of Haofa is that rather than seeing Pacific islands as insignificant specks in a distant sea, an idea that's really kind of embodied in the idea of small island developing states, rather than that, we should understand how, from an islander's perspective, the world is large and connected, a sea of islands, to use his oft-quoted phrase, rather than islands in a distant sea. He's not simply arguing that with UNCLOS and the rise of exclusive economic zones, the ocean space around individual islands matter. Indeed, as he notes in The Ocean in Us, which is his sort of less well-known, his second piece, but definitely cited much less than Sea of Islands. As he notes there, this way of thinking, which draws lines in the space, in the sea, based on proximity to land, ironically buttresses the idea of land as the essence of society. In other words, territory, an idea that actually then reproduces the idea of the island as small and insignificant. So that's not what he's talking about. And of course, Godfrey just made a very similar point in his presentation as well. So one more place where we're actually all saying the same thing. Rather, Haofa is arguing for something more radical, something that I think resonates again with Alison Mounce's point, that thinking with islands and oceans can help us achieve a radical centering. Haofa is not simply arguing for a reversal of foreground and background, moving the ocean to the foreground and the island to the background, so that the scope of islander space is truly appreciated, and so that we understand how islanders and their connections and crossings have big worlds. I mean, he is again doing that, yes, but more profoundly, he also uses the idea of a sea of islands to refer to an islander epistemology that refuses to assume an ontological distinction between background and foreground, whether that foreground is ocean or island. And this is important because the very idea of background and foreground has powerful but limiting resonances. When one accepts such a distinction, one necessarily assumes determinate boundaries in matter, between land and water in this case, boundaries in space between what is here and what is over there. And it also is tied in with a whole way of thinking of time, where these distinctions are seen as permanent. So these determinant boundaries allow us to invent determinant boundaries in identity between us and them, between my people and yours. And this is a point that Haufe really develops in The Ocean in Us, which is largely an article about islander identity and the ways in which islanders have identities in ways that are very different than the modern nation state ideal, based on sort of a starting point of separation rather than connection. So Haufe proposes that rethinking the island sea distinction provides a basis for rethinking not just divisions between different categories of matter and space, but also between identities, forging a path for new, different kinds of identities and a different kind of politics to emerge. In other words, thanks to a different perspective on space that reworks notions of foreground, background, place, and time, islanders, he argues, have come to have different attitudes towards space, power, difference, and thinking with these can be productive for everyone, including, actually, I would add, non-islanders, for reconceiving a world in relation. Now, a few years ago, Kimberly Peters and I published an article on what we call an ocean in excess, which is sort of the most recent installment in what you might call our wet ontology series. And although it didn't occur to me, or I'm quite sure to Kim either at the time, I think we were actually arguing for something kind of close to that islander's perspective that's advocated by Haufe. In our own ways, we're both, Kim and myself and Haufe, are both arguing that the powers of the ocean environment, and here I would include the island, that has these powers to destabilize grounded views of the world, that they're only really realized when one recognizes the ocean as something beyond the borders identified by the blue spaces on the map. Because this whole idea of still separating borders between land and sea, between ocean and island, that still points to a determinism that we're actually attempting to transcend. As we argue in that piece, rather than being contained or defined by borders, the ocean seeps into our bodies, into our thought processes, and into countless spaces that are geographically distant from the sea, or that, in the case of the island, appear at first glance to be of the sea, but antithetical to its liquid essence. So taking this, that's what we mean by the concept of excess. And taking this re-engagement with Haufe further, I wonder if it might be productive to not only think of an ocean in excess, but also to think of an island in excess. As island thinking, as Haufe teaches us, much like ocean thinking, spurs us to radically center neither foreground nor background, not defined determinate spaces and identities, but rather a world of mobilities and immobilities, where identities emerge from continual processes of differentiation and assimilation, and where the material texturing of the world serves to highlight indeterminacy and dynamism rather than the binary and the static. Now, I realize that this is all very abstract, and I just kind of want to conclude by thinking about what this might mean in practice. In other words, how can we think of a world as both an ocean in excess and an island in excess? And I want to conclude with an example that, well, perhaps still maybe not immediately practical, hopefully provides a bit of an anchor through the implications of what I'm proposing. And for that, I want to point to the lighthouse, a structure that in so many ways is both oceanic and insular, and yet at the same time is neither. Now, of course, not all lighthouses are on islands. Many are, but many are not. And just to quickly share my screen, if I can. So for instance, and some are, like this one, St. Mary's Lighthouse, which is about 15-minute walk from where I live, is obviously at low tide, not an island, and at high tide is. But whether or not a lighthouse is on an island, I would say that every lighthouse in a certain sense is an island, in the sense that a lighthouse signals danger and difference, but also connection and sanctuary, all while quite literally serving as a beacon of hope. A lighthouse may simultaneously suggest rocky shoals and a safe haven, the perpetual motion of an endless journey, and the soft cushion of a welcoming destination. Janus-faced, a lighthouse always reminds us that our lives point in both directions, seaward and landward, toward exploration and retreat, and that the two are intertwined and inseparable. From land, part of the appeal of the lighthouse as a place to dream with is that, like the image of the deserted island, it offers both safety and escape. And from the sea, it also offers this message of welcome, but always paired with a warning that both safety and escape may be elusive. In my keynote in Osaka, I mentioned that murder mysteries are often set on islands. They're also often set in lighthouses, and I think for much the same reason: safety and danger, escape and home, difference and familiarity. So if Hauff's island epistemology blurs the distinction between foreground and background, perhaps the same. Viewing the vista from a lighthouse, there is no foreground and no background, only persistent but intermittent repeating light with a multitude of meanings. So in recent years, there have been a number of exciting works that use the lighthouse as both a historic artifact and a tool for thinking differently. Works such as Veronica Strang, Tim Edensor, and Joanna Pickering's edited collection From the Lighthouse, Veronica Dalladora's monograph, Where Light and Darkness Lies, Uma Katari's Borderlands article on the refugee experience of the lighthouse at Lesbos are just three that come to mind in particular. I'm not sure that any of these works directly connects lighthouse thinking with either critical ocean or critical island studies. However, I want to propose that just as lighthouses both cross and quite literally shed light on the distinction between islands and oceans, they can also open doors for understanding how both the ocean and the island, in excess of themselves, can serve as entry points for thinking new worlds. Thanks.
Okay. So I will say now, Elena, what do you can comment on this? And
Yes.
also,
Thank you for your two presentations that are really strictly connected. So I can go back to, I would like to go back to the Alpha's work, because I think it's fundamental in this line of reasoning. And maybe Alpha's is quite famous, but maybe someone of the listener or the public is not so confident with this work. He was actually a writer of short stories, novels, but also an essayist. And I would like to go back to his Our Sea of Island that's been mentioned by Phil, because not only because of the idea that he's presenting altogether, saying that the Pacific is a vast interconnected sea, and that we must underline the importance of the interdependence, mobility, and adaptivity of Pacific Islander rather than the isolation and limitation. And then I like the point he makes about the Pacific Islanders sharing a common heritage and culture that transcends the national boundaries imposed on them by colonizers. And I will go back to this idea later on because it's quite important from the perspective of political geography. But I would like to underline the first line. The essay begins as follows. This essay raises some issues of great importance to our region and offers a view of Oceania that is new and optimistic. I rather like the mention of Oceania because it helps me to stress something about the difference of our geographical tradition, geographical discourse, and our learning. I know that Oceania is not actually very common way for speaking about the Pacific and the island, because in Anglophone geography, it's mostly Australia, while in Italy and also in France, we studied that there are 5 continents and that one of them is Oceania. So Oceania is, as suggested by Lewis and Whitkin in their book about the myth of continents, is a quasi-continent consisting of Australia and the number of isolated island. But no, if we speak about Oceania, following the tradition introduced by French geographer called Conrad Maltebrun, speaking about terre oceanique, and then about another cartographer, French cartographer called André Hubert Bru, who used for the first time the expression Oceanie. Well, Oceania is something that is really speaking to us of a very different way of looking and thinking about the sea. So it's not at all a block or just a scattering series of isolated islands, but is a region. And it's really something that is connected. And so I go back to, do people in most of Oceania live in tiny confined spaces? The answer is yes, if one believes that what certain social scientists are saying, but the idea of smallness is relative. It depends on what is included and excluded in any calculation of size. We are forgetting the skin, just to go back to Godfrey's presentation. And I think that in forgetting the skin, we are just falling in what Walker Connor defined as the myth of land relationships. And describes this myth, saying that there exists a common tendency when looking at the world map to conceive of the blue-painted oceans and large seas as chasms and voids, effectively separating the land masses, particularly Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas, into inward-looking, intra-related worlds. Meaningful relation, it follows, end at the water edge. As a formula, this conception would read, 2 points connected by land are closer than 2 points equally distant but separated by water. Walker Connor was underlying the unfortunate role and the strength of this myth of land relationship already in 1969. And I think that we should remember that also the colonization of the world has been done following this myth. So if we are connected in the same land, you are just the same side, the same culture, you're sharing the same culture. If not, you are going to be separated. As Phil suggested in the presentation, this position is not only historically situated, our relation depends on our technology and how we can move from one place to another, but also deterministic. And then going back again to Phil's presentation, I really believe that it's not at all very abstract what he's saying, not at all, because from a political geography point of view, thinking of small island states or of a whole of a region makes a big difference. And I would like to go here to an episode in my life when I was vice president of the IGU. I tried to develop the framework for the inclusion of the Pacific Islands as a region, not as individual states. But perhaps because that was the request, I spoke with the geographers in Fiji, and they said that they didn't want to be represented in the IGU as Fiji, but altogether with all the island states of the regions. And it was not possible because in the IGU membership, you can be only there as an individual state, not as a region. And so I failed. And I failed, but perhaps you should stress more the relevance of thinking of the ocean as a skin, and thinking of the ocean as an interconnected system, thinking of islands and system islands as regions, and not remember about mobility and cultural connection, not across the sea, but with the sea. And this is what I wanted to underline in my discussion. I don't have question actually, because I think that what has been said is very relevant and very, very clear. It doesn't deserve any question on my side. Thank you.
Okay. So let's see if we have some question from the public.
If I can just make a brief comment here, the lighthouse is also the logo of the Institute of Island Studies at the University of Prince Edward Island. So Prince Edward Island, which is my second home, has been for now 20 odd years, is surrounded by lighthouses. Many of those lighthouses suffer the brunt of storms. And of course, given the savagery of winter storms in Canada, it's also quite feasible to imagine these lighthouses as being actual islands in the middle of winter, you know, being surrounded by snow, being inaccessible. And yeah, but at the same time being beacons of hope, being neither here nor there, isolated and connected. So I think, yeah, the symbolism is quite powerful, and perhaps, yeah, deserves being taught about as well. Thank you, Phil, for that. You also reminded me of the novel by Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse, which in a way is the British version of Il Gatto Pardo. I mean, I know we have Italians here with us. It is the story of change, of modernity, of transition. And yeah, so, you know, it's a way of imbricating the lives of the individuals of a particular family in relation to a particular decision or non-decision, in this case, of not visiting a lighthouse, a missed appointment. Thank you for that.
Philip, do you have some comment?
Okay, now I'm unmuted. I don't have anything huge to add, really. I mean, yes, again, the reason why I brought up the lighthouse is because I was thinking of what is a, I admit I always feel a little bit of an outsider in an island studies thing. And actually that's where the IGU conference was incredibly helpful for me, for not just thinking about the relationship between oceans and islands, but also actually because so much of my work these days is in the Arctic, and thinking about how the ways in which water connects people there across what in many ways are islands. I mean, you have generally connectivity is much easier across water, whether frozen or liquid in the Arctic than it is on land, particularly in the Canadian, North American Arctic and on into Greenland. Almost all of the settlements are coastal and not easily connected to each other at all. So while they're not geophysically islands in a literal sense, a lot of the issues in island studies are highly relevant. And that was actually for me the big sort of eye-opener for me in Osaka, and then in conversations in Okinawa. And I know some of those people are here in the webinar, just realizing how thinking with islands is not just for thinking about islands, that it can be taken in so many directions for understanding more than anything, really, mobilities in people's lives. And that, because once you rethink mobilities, you think about identities and you think about place, and all those become so apparent. And even you think about how and when mobility is, you know, we talked about the, Elena mentioned the sort of colonialist attitude of it's easier to move across land than it is across water. One of the things that struck me in the Arctic is how it's much easier to move in the winter when things are frozen than it is in the summer, which certainly goes against all my instinct that, you know, winter is when you hunker in, but actually it's much easier to move on ice when things are frozen. And that's the time when indigenous people go out to other islands, as it were. So I guess I'm rambling a bit, but I think what I'm trying to do is tie together so many of the themes that have come out in both island studies and in ocean studies and in Godfrey's talk and mine and Elena's commentary, that I'd say there's something for everyone, but it's a, well, I'll use the word excess again, that it's a way of thinking that then exceeds the form and the land form, the spatial form. And I think that's where these kinds of coming togethers are so important and can be so fruitful. So yeah, looking for questions from others to any of us, I suppose.
I think so. You know that there is the Q&A possibility of just putting some written question. You can't participate directly, but you can just write your question on the bottom. On the bottom where there is Q&A in Italian, domande e risposte. If somebody want to just ask something or participate, please.
This would be a good time to invite Takashi to tell us all about the Osaka conference, I think.
Yeah, but we have a lot of time, so just
But maybe some question pops up in the meanwhile. So let's see.
Okay.
About.
So let's see. So we can continue the discussion afterwards, and then now give the word to Takashi, who will be presenting the Island Conference in Osaka, who has been a great success. So we are looking forward to his presentation.
Can you hear? Can you hear? Okay, great.
Yes,
Yeah, I have some trouble with my microphone. I'm sorry. Okay. What I'm talking about is a little bit, going back to the very beginning of this workshop, and I'm going to explain the context of my our Osaka conference. Can I show my slides?
Let's see.
Okay. See,
Please.
Right. I actually expecting to give opening remarks. But people already started discussion, so it's good to hear the opinions about conceptualization and the possible deconceptualization of two geographical entities. However, my own motivation for the conference was actually coming from the sense of sort of crisis in East Asia. So that's why I started thinking of organizing some kind of a conference on islands under crisis. Okay, so the title of the conference is Islands in Relations, Conflicts, Sustainability, and Peace, held last month. We had many participants actually, regardless of the sort of the still influence. We still had the influence of a pandemic, and we tried to sort of collaborate with the Milan conference for some accidental reasons. That was explained at the closing ceremony in Osaka. I just repeated the same explanation. I didn't know Marcella was planning to have a conference on ocean, and I was thinking of organizing a conference on the island. And I sent an email to Elena. Elena told me that the Commission on History of Geography was planning ocean. So I thought, oh my God, we have to compete for the organization of IGU conference just for one place a year or something like that. And so I started thinking of sort of having two conferences together. So this is one of the practical reasons why I try to collaborate with Milan conference. And this is the sort of practical reason, but the more importantly, I thought these two geographical entities cannot be separated, because islands cannot be imagined without oceans and seas and waters surrounding the island. So this is the basic component of the islandness, right? So I decided to sort of collaborate with the Milan conference. And another reason is more sort of coming from my sense of crisis is this my own reaction to growing geopolitical interstate tensions and the militarization of islands like Okinawa in the East China Sea region. So I try to sort of organize joint research project to combine individual researches on border islands in East China Sea. So this is the map I used for the grant proposal. So we had several investigators, and each of them actually looked at the different places in the East China Sea region. So I think the value of transborder island interactions within the region need to be explored. And individual investigators have sort of limited scope or scale of analysis, right? But if they are joined, we could become more comprehensive to think about the crisis, military extension, things like that. So, but unfortunately, the project didn't work well due to the pandemic, and it was extended. The project was extended for 1 year to hold the Osaka conference in last month. So that's how I organized the conference. And I wrote some explanations about the background of this conference, and this is some explanations on the website. So from UNCLOS provisions, I wrote, we can understand that an island is legally imagined as a geographical entity habitable for humans and as a mediator of sovereign control over seas and the sea terrain surrounding the islands. And I maintain these conceptual elements of an island are keys to understanding how it was, what it is treated domestically and internationally. According to this definition, this conference addresses the following 3 component questions. So these are questions. And particularly, I sort of think it's important to think the 3rd question. If geography as a form of knowledge was responsible for the uneven power relations in the past and the present, how can geographers practice geography for island peace? So this is sort of my own sort of subjective motivation for the conference in the sort of the context of geopolitical context of East Asia. And I thought islands in the ocean seas are conceptually and empirically inseparable. That's why I try to collaborate with the Milan conference, because we cannot imagine islands without seas, waters, as I said. The academic division of labor has treated them separately, for a long time. And the legal treatment of the 2 entities, as Phil suggested, has also created contradictions in legal practices. But in a sense, this is important. In a sense, classical geopolitics has attempted to integrate lands and seas in a single relational framework, but at the expense of islands. So this is not the way I want to move on. So I also wrote some passages on my website, our website. Islands are geographically characterized by oceanity, remoteness, and smallness. The vast oceans condition these characteristics, right? So these 2 entities mutually constitute. And I also wrote, while these aspects may lead to their socioeconomic vulnerability, they can open islands toward fishery, inter-island networks, and maritime trade. And I also wrote, islands' unique climate, geomorphology, or ecology can also create distinctive cultures, local products, and tourist attractions. So in this sense, ocean seas are essential component for island sustainable development. So I thought, we can't discuss our conference themes separately. So we should have something shared, something shared between 2 conferences. Okay. So based on these ideas, I look forward to this, bridging workshop and for the 2 conferences, and I think we can have insightful and constructive discussions today. So I'm really looking forward to the Milan conference, and that I'm going to attend in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Takashi. So let's see if there are, Elena, do you have some other point for the discussion?
Yes, I'd like to go back to Phil and Godfrey idea of the importance of thinking islands and the ocean together, and of thinking of the interconnectedness of and intermobility of islands, instead of thinking of them as separated and just indeed when we think about island, above all, when we think about very small island, we think of them in terms of deprivation. They are isolated, they are not connected. When you are on an island, you feel maybe that you need to have much more relation. I was just wondering if, going back to the idea suggested by Phil, that his presentation was abstract, that I think this was not abstract at all. But I was thinking if maybe we just devise a practical way of thinking on island connected to this idea in order to make them less deprivated. So how is it possible to turn this vision of the island as interconnected that actually they used to be, even in the Pacific Ocean that is so big, but indeed they were culturally connected. And so do you think it is possible to turn this approach to the island as a region, as a sea of islands, and not just a scattered, isolated, tiny fragment of land, into something that is useful for them or practical? This is my question, and maybe both of you can answer to try to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll maybe broaden the question a little bit in that it's more broadly asking maybe whether that maybe a new politics, as it were, can come out of that kind of interconnection and that kind of rethinking space, which I know you're not going to like it if I say that takes us into abstraction, but it takes us into hope and it takes us into possibilities. And actually, I found your story of trying to get a Pacific region entity as a participant in the IGU or an oceanic entity. I found that really interesting. And it did make me think about how, I hate always going into Arctic examples, but it is where I mostly work these days. And I actually think there's a really interesting example there from the Arctic Council, where the Arctic Council, it's not a UN agency, it's a high-level diplomatic forum is the technical established terms of reference, I guess. So it's actually not a treaty organization, but it's largely an intergovernmental organization where the main parties are the 8 countries, the 8 nation states that have land territory north of the Arctic Circle. That's the defining parameters, but also with this recognition that there are entities that are trans-border, that cross borders, whose interests are not entirely represented by those states that the territories are all part of. And I don't know of any other organization that has done anything like this, where the Arctic Council has created this position of permanent participant, is the term, and they're not observers. They don't have the full power that states have, because of course their membership 100% overlaps states, and under sovereignty, I mean, a sovereign state is supposed to fully represent all its members. But there's the recognition that that doesn't happen. And part of the reason why that doesn't happen is because so much of the space inhabited by indigenous Arctic peoples is only partially incorporated within the territory of the nation, because it's ocean space, it's ice space, it's this interconnected space of even airspace that ties their lives together. And there's a recognition that the nature of the region isn't really appropriate for the nation state ideal, where territory is supreme, or land territory is supreme. And so a new kind of, I mean, actually, I wish we had had that discussion when you were trying to bring Oceania to the IGU. And perhaps you could have said, well, maybe use the Arctic Council model. Okay, so maybe don't treat it as a meta state, but as a different kind of regional power that has a voice beyond the voices of the individual states, because that's not where life actually exists in the region. And so I think there is political potential for working with that. But what's interesting about that example is and your example as well, is that they're both about reimagining politics, but at the heart of reimagining politics is being attentive to space is different in different parts of the world, and land and water and ice have very different meanings, and that means livelihoods are also different. So and getting to actually the question of geographers, it's actually something, you know, we're supposedly at least really good at, is thinking of those kinds of connections, and why, you know, I think we should have a seat at that table.
If I may comment as well briefly, and then of course I apologize, I have to leave. I think small islanders, including in the Pacific, suffer from an interesting dilemma. On one hand, of course, connectivity is their way of life. So, I mean, you know, they have to live with it, it's there. They have to balance what is available locally with what is not available locally. The ferry schedule, the airline flight options, you know, this is part of their life. They're navigating this on a regular basis. I'm also talking personally here. I mean, I'm probably the most qualified islander in a way on this panel. You know, coming from a small island invariably means that these interconnectivities and what they offer in terms of options, in terms of costs, in terms of regularity, they're all part of our lives. We have to factor them in. At the same time, Phil referred to a politics that somehow engages with this. The politics of small states is in a way excessive. You used the word excess earlier, but in a different context. We are over-governed in small countries. We have multiple levels of representation, and you know, politics is the bread and butter of our lives. And this, in a way, militates against trans-territorial discussions and conversations at the political level, because we're so super democratic entities, many of us, you know, multiple levels, local, municipal, national, regional. I think there's a paper actually that talks about the Federated States of Micronesia as the most democratic, in a quantitative way, the most democratic country in the world. There are so many people who are represented and representative of democratic institutions, it boggles the mind. The Federated States of Micronesia, by the way, is a very small country, but nevertheless, even though it has only 100,000 people, it has 4 states. And guess what? One of those 4 states even has a secessionist movement. Okay, so you can imagine how intensive politics becomes in these kinds of environment. And politics in small place is very personal. Remember, it's associated with individuals. If you don't like someone and that someone doesn't like you, you know, that can peter out and percolate in multiple institutions and organizations. So it can be a very tough sell talking about a politics that on one hand represents people excessively in their local context, but by doing so, perhaps militates against this natural disposition towards openness and connectivity that is speaks to the reality of island life.
If I may add something on this topic, I think that the way of thinking of the interconnectedness of islands should suggest us the possibility of getting out of our Westphalian way of thinking. That's the point. If you succeed in getting out of the schema of decolonizing your way of thinking of space and territory and land, and thinking of connection, it could be a very good move in order to actually go to overcome the problems that Godfrey's underlined and to reach something that is similar to what is happening, luckily, or just maybe not a model, maybe yes, a model in the Arctic. And well, that is, I'm optimistic. And okay, I shut up.
So, somebody else who is, there is a question
from Luca.
From Luca Muscara, who where Godfrey partially already replied writing, but I think it's interesting for everybody. Luca Muscara is writing from Venice, a semi-island for almost 2 centuries after the construction of the bridge to the mainland. He's grateful for a most interesting exchange, but he wants to just add another point to the discussion triggered by Phil's emphasis on the relation between mobility and identity. Despite telecommunication, I wonder if isolation remains a specific character of insularity, which not only deals with the identity, According to David Lowenthal, a scholar that cannot certainly be defined as determinist, who points to another specific character of insularity, the anti-specialized and multidisciplinary culture of islanders in small islands. David's point is that since there are few islands where required to develop knowledge in a variety of fields, if this is true, I wish new research could also focus on how much this lack of specialization of islanders could constitute an alternative paradigm to the excess of specialization of the present time, if it still exists in our time of interconnection.
I guess I'm left to answer that. Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that's a really interesting point that, and again, it doesn't just apply to islanders, it applies to any sort of small state that it requires you have a small number of people. And it sort of gets to the point about, again, the Federated States of Micronesia, and everybody has to be everything. And that does, I'm sure, lead to, and it's part of what an intensification of politics, because, you know, there's that one person who can get everything done for you. But it's interesting. I mean, even here, we have, you know, since he's left us, Godfrey, who is the ambassador for islands, or whatever he is, an ambassador at large in Malta, you know, and an academic, and still spends part of his time in Canada. I mean, that's actually, in a way, we have or had with us one of these multifunctional island Renaissance men. And yeah, what does that do for, that is going to affect the politics within an island as well, that as well as the, does it have positive or negative implications? I'm not sure you can say. It would be a mix. I mean, on one hand, it can lead to some very creative problem solving. On the other hand, it can, first of all, just stress out one person. It can also, in a certain way, which then, as I say, can make it very intense. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point, Luca, and worth considering further.
The written answer of Godfrey was less positive.
Yeah.
He wrote, multifunctionality and flexible specialization is our way of life, Luca. Even in my university, we have no choice. So, somebody else from the public? I don't see any other question.
Somebody's raising hand. Alberto, I can allow him to speak. Should I do that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Can you?
Yeah, you can talk, Alberto, now. You can talk.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where we are. I can't see myself. Probably you can't even see me. Anyway, thank you for the session today. And I'm really looking forward to see you in Milan in a couple of weeks as well. I have a question that evades.
Sorry, Alberto, can you just present yourself?
Yes, apologies. I'm Alberto Forte. I work at the University of Bologna, and I'm working on yachting tourism, actually. And with Alessia Mariotti, we have a session at the upcoming conference as well. Well, we have been working on yachting tourism, actually not as the practice per se, but actually as a tool in order to reunite with the sea, or even reverting the view that we have of the land-sea relationship. One of the things that we have been considering is the relationship between the landed mindset, the changing relationship with the sea and the impact that this may have on urban regeneration in coastal areas, for example. One of the key pieces of literature that has informed our research is actually yours, Philip, the social construction of the ocean. And one of the things that struck me a lot is, as a sailor that actually I am, is actually the relationship that you illustrated of the Micronesians and the ocean. Well, obviously I'm Italian and I live in Rimini, which is on the Riviera. I have been sailing since I was 17. I have been sailing not in ocean, but around the Mediterranean. So I kind of have that contact with the sea. But I come to the question, and I'm sorry that Godfrey had to go, because the question was also for him, given that he gave me the triggers for that. He talked about landed mindset and a landed mindset that forces a view of the ocean, forces a view of the relationship that we have with the ocean. And one of the questions that we tried to answer was, for example, how the EU has been trying to change the view of the ocean through ocean literacy programs, for example, which on one side target specifically the youth, leaving somehow the generation that actually make choices, like us, on the side, as if we didn't count in the equation for the future of oceans. So the question is this: how do you think is limited what the EU is trying to do with ocean literacy in relation to how practices like or practices that get us in contact with the materiality of the ocean would give us? And for example, going back to Godfrey, he said we should become more amphibian in the sense that we should get into the water. And I'm thinking of scuba diving as an activity, as a side activity to actually sailing, because the two go hand in hand. So a long question, because actually it was not even clear in my head, but the relationship between ocean literacy as this top-down approach to having a changing relationship with the materiality of the sea, and on the other hand, the practicality of getting in contact with the sea through sailing, through scuba diving, and all others, if you have an idea. Thanks.
It's a tough question. I mean, first of all, because you're asking, I think, sort of how do you make another way of putting it might be, how do you make this connection between, on the one hand, a sort of rational, scientific, even historical understanding of the sea in our lives, and on the other hand, the sort of emotive, affective embodiment of being in and with the ocean. And of course, in a way, yachting or sailing is a nice sort of halfway between the two, because you do, on the one hand, it involves some stepping outside the ocean in a way, and understanding processes, predicting weather, various amounts of charting and the like. But it also involves being at sea and recognizing you're not totally in control and feeling it in different ways. So, I think there's something to be said for these sorts of, experiential, which of course don't have to be, that costly. There's a whole number of ways of getting people into the water. I must think of some of the work on not just sailing, but surfing. And as again, surfing involves, it's obviously historically rooted in all kinds of ways. It involves getting into the water. It ultimately can become a culture of an amphibious culture, I guess one might say, but also a very human landed culture at the same time. And can also, for instance, like Rebecca Olive's work on actually how you also have to deal with the pollution. And so the ocean becomes unidealized. It becomes part of space of life and its goodness and its bad parts. And and not even necessarily something just to be cleaned up, but is something to be encountered that makes you think about yourself in your environment. So, where that all speaks to specifically the EU's ocean literacy work, I mean, I have to admit, I can sort of guess a lot of what would be in that, but I'm not specifically familiar. This is where I claim Brexit. So, I cannot know about EU things, but I think, but what I see is sort of underlying your question is this question of how do you combine different knowledges of the ocean. And, another possibility is sort of more artistic interventions. I'm working on some projects or beginning to work on some projects with artists and youth engaged in art as a way of it's not purely science and it's not purely the encounter, but it's a way of mediating that encounter through analytical understandings and education. And I think that might also be a way to build connection. I see there's a question here from Rasim.
From Rasim Kamaisi. And the question is, thank you for the important talk and discussion. Could you consider the situation of small states which exist in situation of close border with close state?
So I'm not quite sure what you mean by a closed border with a closed. Do you mean an island that is close to another state and they have?
Yeah, he talks about West Bank or Gaza, something like that.
Oh, okay. So that's not an island, but so an island that is prohibited from having close relations, I believe, is what you're asking with a nearby state. Obviously, that creates. I mean, I guess one could mention sort of Taiwan. It gets complicated, but that would be an example, I suppose, also of an island that has tense, to say the least, relations with a larger mainland state nearby, and of course that can set up whole different development trajectories because in most cases, islands have long histories of trade with nearby regions and migration. And if that is suddenly cut off, you're going to have new projects to develop identity, to develop the economy, to develop politics on that separate island. Is there a way to do that is both adjusts to the separation that exists, but also kind of maintains a sort of co-development with the state? I think that kind of is, well, that's of course a lot of the tension that's going on in Taiwanese politics right now, I would say, just to give one example. But I'm sure you could see that in other places as well, where there's an island that has Cuba would be another example, say, vis-a-vis the US, where Cuba has had a long history of, in many ways, co-development, even as they've been quite different. And now that co-development is in a funny way continuing, but also going in very different directions at the same time. So if I'm reading your question right, I think that creates opportunities, not just for new independent development, but actually getting back to what Elena was talking about earlier, for creating a kind of politics that sort of subverts Westphalian ideas of there are different territories that have different political trajectories and identities, because you have a maintenance of difference, but also some historical cultural connection that's going to continue no matter what, even as those borders are closed.
There is another comments from Luca Muscara. Do you want to read it or I do it?
No, maybe you
Yeah, I
can
think
just-
people can see the comment. So well, you don't have to read.
Yeah. Can everyone else read the Q&A or only the panelists? I'm not sure.
But anyway, I can.
You want to read it, Marcella?
Okay.
And
I
Luca
live-
can look at it. So I think people can look at it.
Yeah, maybe we can leave the possibility to Kevin to look at too, as we done before.
Yes, I think that would be much better because reading is boring.
Yes.
Speaking with would be
Yeah.
better.
Can you make Luca participant?
Okay, yeah, I'm going to let me see.
Luca, are you there?
There
Yes.
are, actually, there are two hands raised. Let me look. Okay, I'm going to allow Luca to speak up.
Yes. Okay. Luca, are you there?
Let me see again.
You just brought Akihiko on.
Okay, so let me get up. Yeah, it's moving, so I just let me try it again. Luca, where's Luca? Luca, I have to find her. Okay, I'm going to look at. Ouch.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's kind of moving. The list is moving because people.
Hello?
Oh, okay. Can you? Okay.
Okay.
Hi, everybody.
Right. Good.
Thank you for giving me voice.
Buongiorno.
Yes.
Very good.
I just wanted to make my point a little bit more precise because by thinking about it, I realized that the alternative paradigm of multifunctionality of islanders in small islands points to the multidisciplinary knowledge that is required by insularity. And the paradox is that multifunctionality required by insularity connects different areas of practice and also of expertise, while paradoxically, the connected state of non-islanders fragments knowledge and practice. So that was my point about the alternative paradigm of isolation and connectedness.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think I guess an interesting question, is that just a question of scale that you're talking about smaller communities and larger communities, or does it somehow, and I don't have an answer to this, I'm putting this back to you, Luca, or anyone, is it just a question of scale of community, or does it have something to do with the histories of islands being connected, that because they've always been connected amidst difference, with both being, sort of extreme, that leads to a certain adaptation of multifunctionality of individuals, whereas non-islands, where there's always been an idea toward specialization within the place, in part because there's an idea of a body of land. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is this and again, I'm not sure whether this would be, it's as much as anything, just the fact that you've got a small number of individuals, or does it have more to do, or as much to do, with the nature of island connectivity? And but either way, I think that's, an interesting observation. And again, I point to the example of Godfrey as somebody who is actually quite connected outside the island, but also is very connected with these multiple roles inside that enables him to do a lot of things across a lot of disciplines, but also a lot of practices.
Thank you.
Okay. There are two hands risen. So,
Okay, should I allow
Julia
to speak?
Julia de Spookers.
Okay.
And the other was Alberto Forte, but maybe he.
Alberto again.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
Julia.
Thank you so much for this talk. I think it's really interesting. For me, it was really interesting. So, unfortunately, Godfrey is gone, but maybe the question is for both of us. So for you, Phil, because I was wondering, you said before, if I understood well, that there is a kind of binarism and you go further, so beyond this binarism of island and mainland in any case. But my point is how we can go beyond this binarism if islands are considered as lighthouses, first of all, exotic, and then the mainland don't consider, in another way, the mainland don't consider the difficulties of the mobility. So it seems to me, and I agree with what Luca said before, that in this multifunctionality, there is also this, yes, the consideration that this binarism is to, we have to pose the question not at the island, but at the mainland, and why they don't consider this, because I think that this is kind of colonization. And as I forgot to present myself, I am from University of Palermo, so I am really someone of an island. And well, I disagree with what Godfrey say about the Ger part, but in any case, he's not here, so I leave it there. So, but I think that this consideration of the connection, as Luca said, is also a question of mainland and not to be exotic. All of us, we are not exotic. And I think that maybe same thing, we can ask to Takashi if it's in Japan, the same thing. And so the question of, you know, the idea that our identities is one, and so it's like in another way, in a cultural way, the same thing about political geography, what Elena said before about the impossibility to be not a state, but an island without a state and have only one voice. So I don't know if it is clear, but this was my suggestion and really a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go first and specifically pick up that issue of, you know, is it a problem that mainlanders exoticize islands, and within a sense, the lighthouse being a really extreme example of that. And I think actually one of the reasons why I like the lighthouse as a way of thinking with islands is that they are so clearly practical, and they make you think about the dangers of sea voyages, about the relative levels of isolation, because of course, lighthouses are all about connection and facilitating connection, but also recognizing the difficulties in connection. And those are all things we need to understand if we need to understand island livelihoods. So it's actually that paradoxical nature of the lighthouse in its practicalness, in its connections to mobility and fixity, that sure, that all comes out in an exoticization. But I think as soon as you start to think about why is it exotic, you know, because a classic exoticization of a lighthouse is it's a haven. You know, it's about safety and it's about an idealized isolation. And you don't need to think about a lighthouse very long to realize it's actually also about the opposites of all those. It's all about danger. It's all about connection. It's all about the fact that we move around between these different spaces, and islands are functional and are affected by all these processes. So I guess in the same sense that, you know, maybe literature and art and all kinds of ways of other perspectives can, sure, maybe in their most pure form are dangerous because they can subvert our critical sensibility. They also are a way of sort of slowly revealing the paradoxes that then make you look further within. So I see your point about the dangers of exoticism, but I like to think at least that it can be harnessed actually to serve purposes.
Thank you.
Some other question? I don't see hands. Yes, there is somebody.
Did Takashi want to address, because I think part of Julian's question, or maybe not, I don't know.
The metaphor of lighthouse, it's kind of hard to imagine for Japanese, before like the 19th century. They might have some kind of device to light up at night for sailing, but I don't know the metaphor can work for explaining some kind of a Japanese perception of ocean or land kind of thing. I'm sorry, I can't answer the question very well. But it's important to think of such a cultural difference. That's why I'm saying that we sort of we can have some kind of partial understanding of the what's going on in part of the world. So, but I think we need to sort of enlarge the scope of scale of analysis to sort of in order to see islands in sort of relations. I think it's important to see more islands, more like archipelagic entities, and also, well, the ocean seas are closely connected to it. So I think it can lead to sort of more comprehensive understanding of what's going on, in, for example, in the East China Sea. We talk about, island territorial dispute, but the islands are not very useful and sort of meaningless as a sort of a material object. But it leads to resource exploitation on the continental shelf and the ocean resources, something like that. So as I said, classical geopolitics actually pick up this kind of relationality of ocean and island kind of thing, and they see islands as a sort of as a like a mainland perception of the island, because islands are important for resource extraction, and the islands are important for strategic objectives and things like that. So I think that's a sort of the dangerous way of thinking, and increasing sort of the crisis in the region. I don't know. I make a question with answer to the Julia's question.
So somebody else. I still see this hand of Julia, but Julia, have you to add something? Or it's just the hand? No, just the hand.
Any other comments from the audience?
Okay, no question also written. But wait, there is this. Yes, here we have another question. Chile Kajihiro from Hawaii.
What's Kai's question?
Kajihiro from Hawaii.
Yep.
So greetings from Hawaii. Thank you for the greeting. Thank you for this important conversation. I have two questions. Could you share your thoughts on the imperial shrinking and relationality of the ocean as epitomized by Eisenhower quote, "We have got to keep the Pacific as an American lake"? And then, what are your thoughts about recent finding that the giant Pacific garbage patch is creating new ecology and new mobilities for species? Two important questions. So Thank you,
Uh,
Catherine.
Yeah, and again, I might bring Takashi into this too, since obviously Pacific American military relations is part of his remit also. But I'll start. I mean, the first one, I mean, they're both in a sense. Okay, let's take them one at a time. The first one, the Pacific as an American lake. I mean, obviously that's an attempt to create it's interesting because, I mean, this kind of gets into the history of ocean imperialism and this contradiction actually that hegemonic, and I write about this in Social Construction of the Ocean, for instance, that, you know, hegemonic ocean powers actually often don't want total control because they're never going to actually have total control. So it'd be better off having a system where you can have relatively informal control and a rule of law where the law is one that largely supports you rather than actual boundary making, because you're never going to have the power to really control the ocean as territory. So it would be best not to set up the possibilities for that. And actually my keynote in Osaka, I talked about that with ice a bit. And similarly, there's a sort of push against by the US against getting ice classified as anything like land. And same is true for the ocean. And so in that sense, Eisenhower's, I imagine that there were probably some lawyers at the State Department who cringed when Eisenhower said that. It's like, don't say that, because once you start saying the ocean is a lake, then everyone claims their bit of ocean as a lake. And of course, you'd start with the bit of ocean that's close to the coastline, which means then suddenly all this, what you could say ultimately turned into exclusive economic zones and the like, would become demilitarized zones, which of course would hardly be what Eisenhower meant when he said creating the Pacific as an American lake. So, I mean, I guess I have to say, I think that's almost an outlier quote. In a way, but it speaks to, I mean, the same sort of thing with, you know, Russia planting the flag under the North Pole. You know, did they really mean the Arctic Ocean is Russian? And then when Canada responded saying, no, the Arctic Ocean is Canadian, states say all these things at a sort of broad political level, and then they quickly step back from that. And obviously Eisenhower's quote is, you know, very different than the refined nature of the Truman proclamations, which were, you know, specifically saying we're not saying these are American lakes, rather they're parts of spheres of influence. So I mean, I think politics and this, I think that would be stuff I think Kyle would be great to keep talking about with you. You know, that politics tends to involve these sort of over-the-top quotes that politicians don't always really mean to create an image that then can be refined through law. And I think the ocean is specifically is a really kind of vibrant place for that, because the ocean is so symbolic as a space controlled by the nation, but not of the nation, because not that many people actually go there from a continental perspective. So that actually then reflects that whole continental idea that we can remake the ocean as a lake. Oh, wait, maybe we can't. Maybe it should actually be a space of sort of externalized control. And I think there's an interesting kind of pattern of those kinds of statements being made, and then, as I say, backed off from at the same time. Second one on Pacific garbage patch, creating new ecologies, new mobilities for species. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, the obviously that ties in with a lot of, you know, talk about the Anthropocene of it's not just that there's a quantitative new level of change of how humans are changing the planet, but that actually it's a qualitative change, that the relationship between humans and nature actually have to be thought about in different ways. And I would say then in this case, also the relationship between land and water, and between natural islands and artificial islands, you know, because which is the Pacific garbage patch? I mean, of course, it's not purely an island, you know, it's not as solid as land, but that itself is interesting. It makes you think about what is land, what is water, what is garbage, what is resource, and for that matter, what is a place, because it's moving. So is it a place, you know, in its own right? Is it a place in its latitude, longitude coordinates, etc.? And is it natural? It wasn't intended to be created by humans, so in that sense, it kind of is natural. It's not a consciously made, reclaimed piece of land, like, you know, an artificial island, but it's also not an island in the usual sense. So while it's useful for thinking about movement and species and how we're affecting the climate and all that, I think places like, or I wouldn't call them objects, phenomena like the Pacific garbage patch also can be not unlike, say, lighthouses, you know, some of these points that can help you think about undoing assumed binaries and then thinking about other possible futures.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. So I see, yes. Another example of excess is the answer of Kyle.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yes, that's really true. No hand raising. Okay, so I suggest that I can now just very briefly present the conference in Milan, and then in the meantime, if we have some other question, we will then leave the last few minutes to answer our discussion. I don't see anything. Okay, so I think that Takashi already told the story of the conference and how, from his point of view, it started. From my point of view, the idea to have a conference on the seas and the ocean was something that we have been thinking from quite a long time. Also in the Commission of History of Geography, as Godfrey said the last time, the sea is history. And then we decided to try the thematic conference. Actually, for me, there was no conflict with the island conference. It was something very important to see the both aspects. Also, while the ocean, seas and islands are at the core of much of contemporary thinking in many directions. The Milan conference is so IGU thematic conference about the initiative of the History of Geography Commission. There is the Commission of Gender and Geography, the Commission of Geography of Governance, the Commission on the Mediterranean Basin, the Commission on Political Geography, and the Joint IGU Commission on Toponymy, and the Commission of Tourism, Leisure and Global Change. We see here how large is the interest that can be connected with the ocean and the seas. And especially the interdisciplinary character of this conference. Ocean and sea are a very complex object of research and are part of what is the relational geographical thought. There is an extraordinary complexity in all marine topics, from education and ocean literacy, we already spoke of that, to the accent and the focus we have now of the debate on climate change and sustainability. So now we have, I think, a 22 session on the most different topics, from history to diversity, to livelihood, to imaginaries and representations, obviously culture and heritage, governance, the idea of spaces of inclusion and exclusion, the emergency of climate change, and the idea of adaptability and resilience of coastal and marine areas. So really a very broad topic, maybe very, quite nearly too broad, you must see, the ocean. I'm very thankful to Takashi, who gave us many good suggestions to the practical organization of the conference. You can ask why Milan? Well, apart that is, I am from Milan, I'm working in Milan, but it is, we have in Milan a course of a magistral course of marine science, and now also a doctorate, and many of us geographers are included and are working on themes and topics related to the ocean. The conference will be, it's very near, will be on the 6th and 7th of June in Milan, and then will continue on the 8th and the 9th of June. And the 8th of June is the World Ocean Day. And there is something missing in Milan, and maybe this is the ocean or also the sea. So we decided to make the conclusion of the conference and the post-conference in Venice, in collaboration with the Ca' Foscari University of Venice, and also with the TBA 21 Ocean Space, that is a research center that is trying to foster a deeper relationship with the ocean thought, especially through the lens of art, because this is also very important connected to the sea. So the imagination, the representation from the point of view of art to also inspire the care and also the action related to the sea. So this webinar for me has been just the first steps to the next conference. And as Takashi could well imagine, we are very busy now in the organization. So let's see if, I'm very glad to see most of you very soon in Milan and Venice, I hope. So I don't see other question or also raise hand. So do you have other comments?
Yeah, actually, I'd like to apologize for waiting some participants to get in until 5 p.m. in Osaka and 10 a.m. in Italy, because we plan to start at that time. But I already sort of make announcement. The session would start at 4:30. That the webinar says. I'm sorry, but it was on time actually. And also this session has been recorded, and once I opened the webinar, so I'm going to upload the video on YouTube sometime later. So some people actually couldn't attend, because of the time difference or something like that. And so I had actually a request that they want to look at the video, recorded the video. So I'm going to upload that, and then I circulated the information among the participants in Osaka and the Milan conferences. Okay. Thank you for attending today.
So if there is no other comment or question, I don't see anything, I thank you very much, Takashi, first of all, and then also our speakers. Godfrey's gone, but Phil and Elena, who has been here with us. And I hope to see you in Milan very soon. I think
Yes.
will be there. So, and also maybe some of the publics. And we will be meeting again very soon. I'm very sorry that I couldn't manage to come. I'm really very sorry to Osaka, but will be next occasion.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Question. Wait, the domanda risposta. There is no. Yeah, just
There's
Luca.
Luca says thank you everyone for
Bye.
Luca was involved in the organization of the Venice part of the conference. So
Okay,
he's
see you in
very-
Venice. See you in Milan.
Okay. Thank you, and see you very soon. So you are going to close because you are.
Okay, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.